So, welcome, dear participants. It is beautiful to have you with us from wherever you are following this deep dive with Kavita Singh, professor at the School of Arts and Aesthetics of Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, that you already met in her earlier sprint, and Clémentine Deliss, associate curator of Carvet Institute for Contemporary Art, Berlin, who will be our first responder for today. My name is Fabian. I will guide you through the deep dives today. We are happy that Kavita and Clémentine are here with us, and we'll take time to answer your questions. So thank you too for being with us, and a warm welcome. First of all, a short note on how you can actually participate in this deep dive. If you have a question, there are 3 ways to include them in this discussion. So the first one is via direct audio in this webinar. Please click on the raise your hand icon, which you can find in the menu bar at the bottom of your screen. As soon as it's your turn, I will call you by name and enable your audio. Please unmute yourself so you can ask your question directly. And as soon as you have asked it, we will turn off your audio again. If you prefer, you can also use the chat in this webinar, or you can also use our online form at campus.re-publica.com if you are following from our website or through YouTube. We will include those questions as well. So as we have little time, let's dive in, and you can already start to send your questions. In the meanwhile, I will give the floor to Clémentine for a brief reaction to Kavita's sprint.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Hello to everybody. Hello to Kavita, who I haven't seen for nearly 10 years. In fact, we met at a conference in Delhi with Martin-Roth and Hartwig Fischer, now the major museum director, and organized by the Wissenschaftskolleg. So it's wonderful to hear you speak now. And I would like to dive in as fast as I can. Before I ask you a question, I want to give a little bit of a survey of what you've said, if that's possible. I think what you do in your paper is that you begin with history and you will end with history. So you begin with the specificity of the Indian Museum. And I don't think so many people realize that there were museums in India prior to the colonial period. This is something fascinating. But what is interesting about your talk is that you show how in a museum in Madras, in Chennai, for example, there were sometimes 70,000 people who came into the colonial museum and who recognized their access as indirectly or maybe in a very politicized way, depending on how they thought themselves, as a civic democratic position. And this is very unusual, even today. So I think that this question of the colonial museum needs to be addressed. In Africa, there were colonial museums that were being set up to engage the colonials who went out, to make them understand how people could be governed, how people could be exploited. And these museums were being built at the same time as ethnographic museums were being built in Europe. We don't hear so much about these former colonial museums. So thank you for bringing that in. The next point that really excites me is this idea of what you call a viewing situation. I would like us to think about the Museum of the Future, not necessarily as a discursive, text-based, illustrative type of exhibitionary activity, but also as something that can promote different ways of visual thinking, different forms of visual thinking. You then, because your paper is brilliant, you go into the question of real estate and gentrification. You say, okay, so maybe if Indian museums had a colonial kind of synchronicity, maybe later, after independence, much later, after the highlight of the Crafts Museum in Delhi, for example, there was a sense, well, we have to catch up. The market is also catching up. We need to go faster. And then you have this plethora of what you call signature buildings that are actually empty, that have become ghosts before they even lived. And we're going to see throughout the 4 presentations tonight that there is a constant coming back to the question of the prioritization of space. And very quickly, you do remember how when Jyotirindra Jain opened the Crafts Museum in Delhi in whatever, late 50s, early 60s, he had studio spaces.
Yes.
Craftspeople worked and probably lived in the museum. So this is important to remember. You speak about markets and collecting, and I understand the point about the radical, in your words, radical inequality and radical unfairness of any form of collecting, pretty much. And really, I guess, any form of market, unless it's really a gift economy. However, there is a kind of a question mark there, which maybe we will be able to address later, and that is the relationship between existing collections, the question of provenance, and then the real no-no, the real kind of taboo, which is just de-accessioning. So when you speak about sharing and moving, and Achille Mbembe speaks about, you know, collections on the move, so to speak, we forget that we have to address the question of de-accessioning, which is very difficult. Then you say, well, what are we going to do? We're going to focus on history, because history is where the museum can really engage with actually quite a diverse public. And we want to involve as many outside voices as possible. So like you, I also believe that a museum cannot be healed from the inside. I think we need the external communities. And you talk about the community of cooperation. Now, my question to you is as follows. You called yourself a museum observer and not a museum maker. And yet you teach students who should, in fact, be going out in life with the urge and the capacity and the competence to address the museums today in the 21st century. So my question is as follows. Number one, who are the agents of change who will activate all these different reformulations of the museum that you would wish for? The relationship between the university and the museum. How do you encourage your art history students to go beyond academia and the safe corridors? And can you bring them to actually want to step over the bureaucratic threshold of the museum and begin to transform them within the Indian context? So when you speak about the autonomy of the university, and you would wish it for the autonomy of the museum, how does education and agency fit into this? Thank you.
It's great to see you, Clémentine. I wish I could reach into the screen and give you a hug. It's been so many years, and it's so wonderful to see you once again. Just very quickly to say that the specific questions that you've asked me, I'm afraid, lead to very specific situations to do with India and even with my university, which I don't think necessarily are the questions we want to open out in a general audience, because I can tell you that historically in India, universities have tended to be left of center. That's not a surprise. That is the case in many, many places. But at the current moment, particularly, being left of center is a very dangerous place to be in. And so at this very moment, we are actually seeing things that I think the world has seen in Latin America, let's say, or in certain parts of Southeast Asia. We are seeing in India right now, where a lot of young student activists and a lot of politically engaged professors are finding every week more and more are being put in jail. Right? So under these circumstances today, to actually imagine that our students could get a foot in the door and could use their awareness and their intelligence and their questioning minds from within the system is not going to work, because specifically universities like my university or other such universities which carry a lineage of left thinking are exactly the wrong place to be from to enter institutions today in India. And I'm saying this about India, but I'm sure there are resonances in many parts of the world. There have been since the 1970s in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, and in Latin America, and they continue to be in many places. So that's partly why I was also imagining that if the institution of the museum is so ossified, then the public takes ownership of the museum, including those functions of the museum that the museum does not fulfill. And you could actually imagine this having resonance in other places as well. So, for example, instead of waiting for a conscientized curator from within the British Museum or from within the Louvre to extend an invitation to immigrant communities, if immigrant communities already have the right to buy a ticket and enter the museum, why can they not also articulate their viewpoints without the formal invitation from the institution, right? So in a sense, I am accepting that there is in many places a kind of a rightward drift, which means that these institutions of museums, which are very much connected to national pride and therefore get locked into a position of service of the state, may not have the power to reinvent themselves. And so there is a need to take agency and power from outside. I think that's what I was trying to say without being quite so blunt and direct about it.
Okay, we have questions coming in from through our online tool at campus.re-publica.com. And Krista Clark is asking, what practical steps can be taken to the kind of collection sharing vision that you have shared?
Well, thank you very much for that. So I think one of the good things about the idea of collection sharing is that it, I hope, gets over that paranoia about deaccessioning, which Clementina had brought up, because a lot of museum directors seem to have this fear that the idea of circulation means an idea of letting go, and it seems to get caught up in certain very entrenched positions, which are positions about property, you know, so the way we protect our property and our possessions. This sort of invites that kind of reaction. So if it becomes a position of sharing and of circulation and of long-term loans and the acceptance that there is joint custody for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years for the foreseeable future for certain kinds of objects, I think it gets over a certain mental impediment. Where the harder thing to cross, and this is a really hard bridge to cross, but when we talk about decolonizing the museum, we have to talk about making the possibility of the museum accessible to a larger and larger circle. And we have to recognize that a lot of the time, the things that we call best practices that we think we are promulgating in the service of heritage and its prolonged life are very exclusionary practices. So some of the conservation protocols that we apply, I know this is not a popular thing to say, but I really believe that a lot of the conservation protocols and the display protocols that we apply are actually designed to keep museums and exhibitions the exclusive province of a rich boys club. And so actually, again, the hidden subtext of saying that we should share collections and circulate them is also that we have to let go of certain protocols about, you know, what is the appropriate climate, what is the appropriate environment, what are the appropriate standards of care, who are the people who are appropriate to touch or handle or courier this object, you know. These things also have to change, which would be the harder things to let go internally in the institution. And the only good thing about it is because they are technical and they're internal in the institution, they can be sorted through internal debate rather than what hits the headlines when you say, oh, we're going to give the Elgin marbles back to Greece, or we're not going to give the Elgin marbles back to Greece. The idea of transferring ownership and possession turns into a debate that everybody has an opinion about. Whereas technical issues that have been long-standing impediments in circulation, I think, can be more quietly compromised upon.
I would like to take one more question from the audience and by Natasha before we have to finish this deep dive, because we have only 2 minutes left. What role do colonial museums play in discussions about ethnographical museums? Where are the connections from the past, but also where are the connections in the current discussions? If you can give that very brief answer to this very complex question.
Well, it is a huge question, Natasha, and I'd like to actually sidestep it by saying that certainly in countries like ours, in India, what we need to think about very deeply, and I think with an appropriate degree of shame, is the perpetuation of colonial structures within our museums today by us. So that those of us who happened to be in a position to capture mainstream power within our countries continued to exoticize and marginalize certain groups, even in the ways we celebrate them. And to me, there is nothing sadder and more shameful than an Indian museum that celebrates tribal art or tribal culture sitting in the middle of a district where the very same communities that produce the art or the customs or the artifacts that we think are so ingenious and wonderful, the very same communities are being driven out of the lands they live in because of redevelopment projects, are being thrown out of forest reserves that they used to traditionally have access to, or are being pushed into the kinds of sectors of the economy where they do their labor with absolutely no guarantee of compensation or any kind of security at all, you know. So what is actually happening to tribal people in our country, for instance, stands so starkly at a variance from the terms in which they are celebrated in these leftover colonial museums that we continue to keep open and just slightly renovate and refurbish. And no museum has place to talk about the actual tragic and terrifying reality of the experience of tribal people in India today. I'd rather reflect on what we lack now rather than think about the lacks we inherited 70 years ago.
Well, thank you very much for this very interesting talk, for this very interesting deep dive as well. So thank you for taking your time, Kavita, to answer this question in detail. It was really wonderful to have you with us. I took a lot from it. And a warm digital applause to you. Many thanks to all of you participating in this session as well, and to our first responder, Clémentine, who will remain with us for the next deep dive with Philip Chinari, which will begin in just about 1 minute on this very channel. You can stay tuned here and just stay with us for the next deep dive.